So as Jenny said, I'm new at BioNB. I'm excited to be here. I started about a month ago, and on I think day 2, Jenny said to me, I'd love it if you could do a webinar for our spring webinar series, and I said, yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to, and the topic immediately jumped into my mind. It was about market validation. This is really close to my heart because in the past, I've done it all wrong. I've done market validation all wrong, so I learned the hard way, do it the right way. And a lot of the ideas we're going to talk about today are new. You may have encountered them, but it's only been about the last 5 years that the stuff we're going to talk about today has started to come to the forefront. It's part of the lean startup movement. And I actually taught a course. I taught market opportunity analysis, market validation a few years ago, and I taught it the old way, and I was questioned how I taught it. And I was using the standard materials, and I started to question why there had to be a better way to validate instead of writing the big long report, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I was really excited to learn about these new concepts, and I'm excited to share them with you today. So we'll start with a definition of what market validation is, and there's 2 parts to it. The one we're going to focus on today is really simple. Is there a market for my product or service? The assumption is you're starting with an idea or a concept, a prototype, which is the typical start of any business. And we want to determine if there's a market need for it. I want to distinguish that from concept validation, which a lot of people get confused with. Concept validation is deciding whether or determining whether an idea or a piece of technology actually works. And that's great, but if you're trying to start a business, it has to have a need in the market and a customer out there that it will give you money so that you can build a business. So they're 2 different things. We don't want to confuse those. The second box on the right is the second part of market validation is determining if your market's big enough to build a viable business. That's a whole other kettle of fish. We're not going to get into that today. Maybe in the future webinar we will, but the more important part at this stage is determining, hey, I've got a product or service that somebody out there needs. The second piece of that is, can you make a lot of money off it? Venture capitalists are looking for markets of $1 billion or more, size of $1 billion or more. So, you know, you want to be able to start a business that's going to have a high return because you put a lot of time into it. Why do you do market validation? Or how do you do market validation? It's done by interacting with customers from as early as possible. And that's the key to it. And that's the focus of today, is it's talking to people and learning as much from them as you possibly can. And you will find out a lot of information by talking to people. And why do you want to do market validation? You want to determine if your idea is worth pursuing. And why? Because you don't want to waste your time, energy, and money. The most valuable resource you have is time, and the cruel reality is most ideas are not going to be viable businesses. Ideas are dime a dozen, but if they turn into an economic entity, it's a whole other kettle of fish. Your time's your most valuable resource. I work for a startup, and we spent 3 or 4 years building a product that was wrong for the market, and we spent a lot of money and time and energy, and I call it the head-banging phase, when we banged our heads against the wall because we couldn't figure out why nobody wanted to buy what we thought was the perfect product. So I've been there. It's a real painful process to go through, and you don't want to make it any longer than you have to. So the question in the past has always been, can you build something? And we have a contractor in the business I work for, and Tony always says, yeah, Ryan, I can build you anything you want. The question is, do you have the money to do it? So yes, you can build that product, you can make that technology. But the question that you should ask is, should this product be built or should this service be delivered? That's the key question. And the should relates to the fact is, will somebody give you money for it? Can you build a business around it? And the chances of that, as I talked about, are much slimmer. When people start to have an idea for business, and entrepreneurialism has become very popular, it's kind of a trend. There's a lot of ideas out there, a lot of people wanting to do startups, and ideas are great. I don't want to poo-poo the enthusiasm around that, but what people tend to do, and I've done it, is you assume you know who your customer is and what your product is about. The key thing you got to remember is you're starting out, you're just assuming that. You're sitting in a room and you may be writing a business plan, and I've done it, where you sit down and you think, this is who the customer is. I just think this is who the customer is, and this is the product that's going to solve their problem. So it's key to remember that you're starting out with assumptions, not facts. You're trying to find facts, and that's what market validation's role is to separate the assumptions from facts. You can start with assumptions, but you want to move towards evidence. So I taught a course in market opportunity analysis or market validation, and we followed the product development model. I worked for a startup that followed the product development model. A lot of you have probably seen this. There's various iterations of this model. Stage gate is one of them, for example. I like to call this the if you build it, they will come. I think Kevin Costner did a real disservice to the startup world with that movie Field of Dreams, when if you build it, you will come. A lot of people assume that's what you just need to do, is open a door and people will march right in and give you their money, but that's not the case. So the product development model, you start with an idea, and it's called Plan A, and then you sit down and you write a big business plan. Maybe it's 50 pages, 100 pages. I wrote a 125-page business plan once. It had the best spreadsheets in the world, but they didn't amount to anything at the end. You might do some what we call desk research. So you go out and gather some market research reports, go to the library, do some Googling, and the goal here is to get some funding. So you got this wonderful business plan. Then you get the funding, you go out and build the product as you think it fits the market. You might start developing your marketing materials at this point. And then this is particularly a case of software, but it holds true for any technology, as you do testing. And the testing you do surrounds usability. So in the case of software, you would do some quality assurance, or any technology. If it's a new car, for example, you would make sure it works, that it turns on. A company I work for, we did usability testing, and we had 100 people or something in it. They all loved it. They said it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And really what they were saying was, we loved how it worked, we loved the colors, we loved the layout, we loved the feature set, etc. What we weren't talking to them about or trying to find out was whether it was suitable, whether it met their needs, whether it was solving a real problem. So a lot of people confuse this usability of a product versus the suitability to the market. So technological usability versus market suitability. Then you get ready for a launch. You hire a PR firm, you hire PR staff, you might hire a sales VP because you're ready to put this out of the market, and you might organize an event to do a launch, and you're launching Plan A. This might be 3 years later, but you're launching that initial plan, and most times the result is a big thud when you land on the market, because the customer that you thought you had is not who ends up buying your product, and the problem you're trying to solve may not be the problem that needs solving. And I worked for a software company, and I started just before we did the launch, and I was there during the launch period, and there's a lot of excitement around this program going in the market, and the expectation was that tons of orders were going to come in the minute the press release went out, and this was not the case. Zero orders came in. We spent a year doing market validation, going out and talking to people and figuring out what we did wrong, and we learned that our customer we had chosen was not the right customer. We found it was a different customer. And the product we had developed, we completely pivoted the whole product, and we'll talk about pivots in a moment, but we retooled the whole product. So this we did in a 3-year period, spent a few $1 million. If we had done this market validation, we'd gone out and talked to customers back At the start of this process, we would have learned a lot more. We would have built a product that customers would have wanted, and we would have launched it, and we would have had uptake. So the product development model, it is a useful tool, and it's great for what's called established business model. And a business model is simply just a way you make money. And I like to use simple examples, and I always use a shoe store to explain a lot of business concepts. And if you think of a shoe store, that business model, it replaced cobblers about 75 years ago. And if you think of a shoe store, it's in a retail setting, it's in a mall or downtown. And the business owner opens it, and they buy their shoes, their stock from a distributor. They market in the newspaper maybe, or walk-bys, or word of mouth, and they hire some staff at reasonable wages, and they sell the shoes. So, you know, if you were the first shoe store that opened, you had to explain to people what you were doing. But basically what you're doing is you're copying an established business model. There's some reasonable certainty around whether you're going to be successful or not. Your customers understand it. What you're trying to do is determine if it'll fit a particular market. So I don't know how many shoe stores are in Fredericton. Let's say there are 15. Can you fit into that market? Is it super competitive? Do you have a niche strategy? Do you have a competitive advantage? Can you execute better is the key here. Maybe you have a better location or better customer service, so your shoe store is going to fit into the market. So this is what I got confused when I was teaching market opportunity analysis. I taught startups using established business models, the process. So we did all this research, census data, and collecting information from market research reports and trying to say, well, we'll extrapolate and do some Excel modeling and figure out if this is going to work. But the issue with startups is they're new products and services. Nobody's heard of them. Nobody's really defined the problem that's trying to be solved. People don't even know what the heck you're trying to do. This is what I found when we were trying to sell the software. We had to spend a lot of time explaining to people what the software was, what it's for, how it's used, and we were trying to figure out the business model, how we would make money. We were trying to figure out who the customer was. So that requires a different process of market validation. So you're not going to sit in the library, or necessarily you're going to have to execute better than your competition, but that's not the focus. And this is where the customer development model comes in. And this is just developed in the last 8 to 10 years, and it's the person, the big guy behind it, is a guy named Steve Blank, who you may have heard of. He's kind of the grandfather, the godfather of this area. And he teaches at a number of universities, Stanford, et cetera, and he's a big believer in talking to customers, and he coined the phrase, get out of the building. Which you may have heard that term. So what Steve says for the customer development model is you want to start with concept. That's great. Ideas are wonderful. But what you want to do is you want to test them as fast as you possibly can, because guess what? It's probably not going to work. It might, but probably not. What you try and do is form hypotheses, some guesses about who your customer is, what the problem is you're trying to solve with that product, which is the solution. So your product or service is the solution. And I think that the big issue, I have an MBA, and I think the big issue is that MBAs don't understand the scientific method. And working at BioNB, a lot of the people in the audience are scientists. And you guys in the lab are familiar with the scientific method. You have an insight, you start out with some hypotheses, and then you go and do some research, you do some testing, you do some experiments to test those hypotheses. The MBA people tend to sit down and think, I know the answers to all these questions, and I just got to go build a business. They're a little bit more action-oriented, and this tends to fall apart. And what Steve says is product development works Fortune 500 companies, doesn't work in a startup because you're in pioneer territory. So you go out and you test these hypotheses, and how do you do that? You don't go to the library, you go and you talk to people. You go out and talk to customers, not fellow researchers. You want to talk to people that have an economic interest in what you're doing. And as you test about who your customer is, what their problem is, and what solution they need, you're going to either pivot or proceed. Pivoting means that you might change who your customer is, and this happens. As you go in and talk to people, you'll be amazed about the information you can get from talking just even to a dozen people. You may find you have the wrong customer if you identified with your initial assumption. You may find that the problem you're trying to solve isn't really a big problem. Maybe there's another problem. And the product you've developed, the technology, for example, you may have to tweak it. Maybe there's an element of it you could expand on that would better serve people's needs. That's what pivoting is. So you may have heard of that term. And then the opposite is proceeding. So if you've validated a hypothesis, then you can say, okay, we're on to something. Let's proceed. So once you've solidified your customer, your problem, and solution hypotheses, and that can take the ideas you want to do that in a short period of time. Some of these IT companies, which is in my thinking is much simpler than bioscience, you can do this in a few days. I've seen people do this in a few days. They go and talk, three guys will go talk to 300 people. But ideas you want to do this as fast as possible because the opportunity of cost of your time is quite high, especially as a researcher. These other projects you could look at doing. So don't waste 3 years of your life doing market validation, because your goal is to somehow find, if you want to start a business, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you want to find a problem you can solve, and you want to make sure it's scalable. So that's the second part. I'm just going to touch on this today. This is where the market research comes in. Once you figured out who your customer to your market is, you go decide how big is that market. And like I said earlier, VCs, venture capital investors, want a market that's $1 billion, at least $1 billion. The bigger the better. They want it to be growing. Now, of course, all markets grow. Every report I've ever seen says that a market continues to grow. You really want to find out if enough people want it, if we can build a business that's big enough. Then you get into the business plan, the traditional business plan, if you have to write that. You polish your product because you've got some funding, where you do your design and your quality assurance. And then the third step is building this business, which is a whole other world where you're hiring staff and you're having functional organization and all that stuff, setting up an HR department. And as your company grows, it'll get bigger and bigger. That's down the road. We're focused on today is saying, hey, if this idea I've got, worth pursuing. So the three hypotheses, I just want to highlight these, is the customer hypothesis. So who is the problem you're trying to solve? And you might have 1 or 2 or 3 different customers. You don't want 30 different customer segments. You're trying to find 1 or 2 or 3. What the problem is that customer has, and a common term is pain. You're trying to find the pain that somebody has. And you're trying with your solution, your product or service, to solve that problem or solve that pain, find that painkiller. So these are the ones you're initially starting out to validate. And you want to start it by making an assumption. That's fine to do. It's fine to start with hypothesis, but you got to go and validate that. What you're trying to do here is find a value proposition. Now this is MBA speak. This word is thrown around all the time. I don't know if everybody understands it, and I just want to clarify that because it's a very valuable, very important concept. And value proposition basically means it's how you solve a problem for a customer better than someone, that would be a competitor, or something else. And what I mean by something else is maybe they're doing a manual process right now and switching to your automated process to do refining, for example. They may do that, they may not, but what's the value? How would they want to change what they're doing? Getting companies especially to change the way they do things is often difficult. So you have to show value, you have to demonstrate value that you're going to solve that problem for that customer better than an existing process or better than an existing competitor. Really easy way to think of it is, why do they choose you over something else? So that's what a value proposition. So that's what you're trying to find out with your startup. So just to highlight this, the customer development process is you form hypotheses, you test them, and you gain, and it's a cycle. So you reform those until you've validated them all. And I'm just going to give an example This is an idea I had, and this is a made-up example. I haven't actually done this, but I had this idea that Fredericton needs a direct flight to Boston so that people can get into the U.S. market faster. There used to be a flight Delta had a few, well, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. It shut down because the airline that ran it went bankrupt or something, but it was quite successful. So how would I go and test this hypothesis? Well, I said, oh, I'm going to go talk to 27 people and identify, well, I'll go out to the airport and talk to the people out there, and I'll talk to people at the Chamber of Commerce, talk to just regular people, but not friends or family. We'll talk about that in a moment, and just get their sense of, do they need this service? What do they think? And I might find when I go out there and find out that a few business travelers are frustrated. The people going on vacation would rather go by Air Canada all the way. They don't really have a need for this. And some business travelers need to save time to get into the U.S. So I started out with this hypothesis that there'd be massive demand for a flight from Fredericton, and found out after talking to some people that it wasn't as big a demand as I thought. So now we'll get into some practical applications here, how you actually do this, and we're going to focus on customer interviews, and that's where get out of the building comes from. So form those hypotheses, and then it's time to shut off the computer and walk out the door. So you want to talk to customers as early as possible, and we're going to talk about some sensitivities around IP in a moment, which is particularly relevant for bioscience firms. A couple key points is you don't need a lot of data to learn. Actually, I was talking to a client of ours yesterday, and when they're looking at going in different markets, he said that, you know, we find we get a lot of information just from talking to people. If we talk to 10 people in the market, in that industry, in that field, we get a really good sense of what's going on. So you don't have to go talk to thousands and thousands of people. Depends, of course, and we'll talk about that. But you're trying to get a negative or positive signal either way and see where it leads you. If you talk to 10 people and they're all say, "Yikes, that's crazy," then you know you're probably on the wrong track. The opposite is true as well. It's easy to go talk to your friends and family, but they're going to tell you you've got the greatest idea in the history of the world, unless your grumpy uncle is the kind of guy who's going to tell you the truth, which is good in ways. You don't also want to talk to your fellow researchers because they're going to focus on the science. They're going to say, that's great science. They're not necessarily going to focus on the economic potential. Got to remember here, for comfort's sake, you're not selling your idea, so you're not going out there to cold call and sell people. You're just going to get information. It's a research project. People love to tell you what they think. And you want to meet in person. You don't want to do this by email, by telephone, because you want to get the body language. We're going to talk about an example of the National Science Foundation. They use Skype because a lot of customer reviews are done worldwide. Skype or FaceTime, if you have both of you have Apple products, it's a great tool because you can make that human connection. What you're trying to do is test your hypotheses. Saying is your mom is not your market, so don't talk to your friends or family. You've got to go talk to real people out in the field. So how do you find these people? You can begin with your friends and family and your personal network to get you connected. Industry leaders, you can find the names of people in your industry on blogs. LinkedIn is a fantastic tool if you're not signed up, to get signed up, and then you get connected to people and you can reach out to people that are in your field. One way is to go to the website of conferences that are in your field and just look at all the speakers, grab their names, phone numbers, emails, and shoot them an email. And authors in the field, not necessarily of journal articles or research, but people that might have written a book, a business related in the business press. Industry associations are great. BioNB, one of our big advantages in how we can help is we have a big Rolodex of people that are connected into the bioscience field. So we can help connect you. That's our thing. We connect researchers to people that can help you develop a business. Conferences and trade shows, if you've got the funds, they're a great place to go and walk the floor and meet people. And a lot of the conferences I'm noticing these days have formalized programs where you can set up one-on-one interactions where you would register and you would be matched with people and you would be scheduled with a coffee date at the conference. So it gets around that going to the conference and having to find people, which is kind of a daunting task at times. As you do interviews, you'll get referrals to talk to other people. It snowballs. It's not just potential customers, it's partners that you may have down the road. It's suppliers that you may have, and even competitors. And we're going to talk about, you're not getting into the details of your product at this point. You're just trying to understand who the customers are in this market and what problems they have. So talking to customer or competitors is a really useful tool. How do you get an interview? Phone or email, there's a structure to it. You want to make an email in this example easy for somebody to read. As I mentioned before, we are going to send this out by email, so you'll have a copy of it. There's 5 parts to this email. There's a connection, so how you know this person, and a real quick summary of the idea you're working on and what the existing problem or existing solutions are out there and why maybe they're not working as you see it. And the ask is that you're looking for expertise from people. And people love to give you expertise. Tell them what they think. Tell you what they think. This particular email, he actually says, I'm not selling you anything, so you can be blatant about that. And the final piece is the exchange. You've got to offer them something in exchange for their time, and it's best to go and visit them, make it convenient for them. So interview technique. So there's 2 ones I want to highlight here, and I'm focused on these initial conversations. And this is one that Steve Blank suggests. And what you do is you start with a sheet of paper and you put 3 columns across with a pencil. You write problem, current solution, my solution is the headers across the top. And you only show 1 column at a time during your interview. So you would start with the problem. So you would say, you describe the problem as the customer sees it. And you ask them, does this ring true? And after you've exhausted that section, you move on to the current solutions in the field. So you discuss what the customer is using, and really try and understand how they use it, what complaints they might have about it, what other tools might work, what other processes might work. And this is optional, and it depends on what stage you're at. This is a very iterative process, but I'm going to mention it here, as you can talk about your solution to the problem, and you're not getting into the details at this stage, but talk about your solution and describe why you're different. And I wrote, and sit back, because the focus here is you're trying to listen to what they say. Another tool is the big questions, is to ask, what is the biggest pain about how you work? And the second one here, this is a powerful question, and a boss of mine, a VP of Business Development, used to use this exact line when we were doing customer uncovery and market validation after we launched the software. And she would say, if you could wave a magic wand and change anything in what you do, what would it be? And this causes people to really open up. I've seen it, the twinkle in the eye, the smile on the face, because they drop their guard and they're just dreaming a little bit. And you can learn so much because they're not worried about money or all the politics in the company or all this kind of stuff. This is where you can get some real kernels of truth and really understand what problems they're facing and how you can solve that, and if the solution you have might fit that. So at first you're focusing on the problem solution, not idea. You don't go into these initial meetings with do your demo or bring in a piece of technology and put it down on the table and say, here's what I've got, what do you think? No, you're focusing on that problem solution hypotheses. Some tips. It's great to take notes. It's really important to take notes, get it out of your brain. You need to be able to gather it all and synthesize it. You may collect a fair bit of information. You want to ask people if it's okay if you can take notes. Avoid the focus group. What I mean by that is it should be a one-on-one interview, maybe you and your partner, but one other customer, because focus groups lead to groupthink. People aren't honest in them. They just say what they think the group wants to hear. I know that SurveyMonkey is free and easy and used a lot, and I use it, but it's got no place in customer development interviews because it provides answers, and people aren't honest on interviews, and actually people are getting tired of filling out the big long interviews. Surveys have a place down the road when you're trying to determine size, the scalability of the business, because you know the answers at this point of who the customer is. You're actually talking to people who might buy your tool. Learning is the goal here, so if somebody trashes what you're trying to do, don't get defensive and try and sell them. Just close your mouth and listen to what they're saying. That's hard to do, but you will learn a lot from that. And it's good to ask them when you start out and say, I want you to tell me what you really think, because I do not want to waste the next 5 years of my life building something nobody wants. So giving them that license to do that will be helpful to you down the road. Ask open-ended questions, focus on the problem, not features. The cheesy clip art there is meant to say, just to remind you, is your role here is to listen. 90% of what you're doing is listening, you're not talking. At the end, you want to ask for introductions to other people, and you're going to find that people will give you names, maybe more than you want. I've been in meetings when you walk out of there with 15 names to follow up, but that's great. That's what you want, and you want to follow up with a thank you maybe the next day, 2 days, and ask for those intros, because they'll walk out of that meeting, they'll be having dinner that night, and they'll think of 3 other people to talk to or another program to look at. They're going to give you more information. How many interviews do you have to do? It depends. If you're doing consumer stuff, and we're not doing that here in the biotech, but look at about 100 interviews. In some cases, I was watching the webinars and have to do 1,000, which is not impossible if you've got a team of people. Business to business, usually looking at 20 people in the field. I was talking about the example of the guys that they talk to 10 people. I mean, they're selling in an industrial world, so talking to 10 people gives them a really good sense of what's going on in the market. The National Science Foundation, which we're going to talk about in a moment, they require their teams to do 100 interviews minimum. And they get a lot of rich data out of that. Good starting goal, we like to tell people, go talk to 12 people and then let us know what you find out. And you're going to end up talking way more, but that initial 12 really gets the ball rolling. How many do you need to approach? Sometimes multiply that, how many you want to do, by 3. The interviews are the short part. It's getting the interviews the hard part, because everybody's on vacation, they've got busy schedules, et cetera, et cetera. So the time period may, be longer than you think, but you just persevere in getting these interviews because they're worthwhile. Excuses for not doing customer development interviews. Google's great. All the answers, I guess, are out there, maybe. They're not really, to be honest with you, because you're doing something new. Nobody knows your market is. You're creating a market. So that research report isn't sitting out there in some library or on some website that's going to tell you everything. I've never found that. I've never found a research report that told me what I wanted to find out. I've always wished for that. Here's a common one: my product's not ready to sell, and that's for sure right, because you're not ready to sell it. You don't even know if you have a product that anybody wants to buy, and that's what you're trying to find out here. I'm shy is an issue. A business is a people game, so you have to come out of your shell. But one thing about customer development interviews is people love to help, as I mentioned, and you're not doing a lot of talking. They're doing the talking. You're just listening and learning. And you're going to find that you start with some names that you won't even have to ask for referrals. You're just going to get names, and you're going to get introduced to other people. So it's actually a pretty easy process to do, to be honest with you. It seems daunting when you start out. It seems like a lot of time, but you're going to get a lot of value out of it. It's going to save you a lot of time down the road. Final excuses, my idea would be stolen. This is an issue for bioscience, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But the issue is if you hold your cards too close for a long time, you're not going to get anywhere. That said, your IP is key when you're doing technology, and I'm not talking about software, I'm talking about real processes, the kinds of things our clients are doing. You need to review your protections before you do customer development interviews. Doesn't mean you have to go out and get a patent and hire lawyers, but you need to talk to somebody and see where you're at, what you need to do. Because talking to the public, which is what you're doing, can be considered to be public disclosure, and that can prevent you from filing a patent down the road. There is the ability to use a non-disclosure agreement, but again, you need to get advice around the proper format. I mean, you can download those off the internet, but whether it's useful to you is another question. And some people don't want to sign these things. Resources for getting some help. You don't have to, like I said, go talk to the patent attorney right away. I mean, it's $500 an hour just to say hello. CPO is a great resource. If you're in a university setting, there's the Technology Transfer Office. Just about every university has one. UNB, if UNB has Office of Research Service. And BioNB, we're a great resource. We're not lawyers, we're not experts at IP, but we can connect you to people that can help review where you're at before you begin this process. But I want to say, and Steve Blank actually did a video on this for Bioscience, life science, pharmaceutical, and said, you know, you're listening to people, you're not giving them all the details, you don't even have to tell them what you're doing necessarily, you're just trying to understand the problems they have and what kind of solutions they might be looking for. So related to bioscience, life science, I wanted to talk about the National Science Foundation, which is in the U.S., and they formed the ICOR in, I think it was 2011, and they've done this program every few years. It's a 10-week program, and the goal is to commercialize technology coming out of research labs and universities down the States. And it's in life science, biotech, pharmaceutical, that kind of stuff, not IT, not anything like that. And the 2014 program, there were 19 teams, about 100 people on the teams that are researchers. Steve set up the course. It really was around, you got to go talk to people. You've got some assumptions, let's go talk to people and find out if you're right. They talked to 2,000 customers in this 10-week process. They tested 700 hypotheses, and 215 pivots in the business plans came out of this this particular 10-week program. And the link that you'll get in the deck takes you to a summary of about a dozen of the companies, and they each had to do a 20-slide presentation about what they learned, where they started out, and what they learned. And I'm going to talk about the BCN Bioscience is one of them. They developed a cancer drug that increases the anti-cancer effect of radiation in lung cancer. And they had these hypotheses. They sat down and they said, we figured it out. We know all about this industry. We know what we're going to do. We're ready to go. And they got into the ICOR program, and they were told, well, okay, that's great. Good start. Let's go see if that's true. They talked to 101 people in 10 weeks. And they determined that all 4 of their hypotheses were wrong. So they initially thought that their customers were radiation oncologists to buy this particular drug, the doctors, and they found that doctors could care less. They didn't want to have anything to do with it in terms of buying it in an economic interaction. It was the licensing directors at the big pharma companies that they determined were their customers. Mechanism of action data, they felt it wasn't needed for the drug, and they determined after talking to people that, yeah, you do need to get that. And they assumed that they needed to do a phase 1 trial, and they found they didn't have to, not for licensing. The model they were going to do was licensing, and they assumed that it would take them 6 years and $5 million. This was interesting because they found out, because they did the licensing model, that it would only take 3 years and half the money, which was nice, which is a nice thing to hear. So the other thing they found out was that the solution they had was limited, and that when they talked to people, they found out that it could be used for some other medical issues, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, tumor sensitization, and dermatology applications. So this created other revenue streams, increased the value of the business. So they learned a lot by going out and talking to people, and their plan initially was to get the sales guy and start going and knocking on doors of doctors. And they just took this 10 weeks, and they learned a lot and retooled their entire business plan. Speaking of business plans, the last thing I want to say is that business plans have a role, and the picture there I have is the traditional 100-page plan, but the point I want to make right now is you don't start out by writing that business plan. That comes later, and I'm going to do a webinar in a couple weeks on lean business plans, which I say don't bother with that big, long, fat document because it's a waste of time and trees. But the business plan is essential in developing a business. It's just the format and when you do it. And if you go through the customer development market validation process, you're going to have a valid business plan. There's nothing better than going to an investor and saying, yeah, we talked to 500 people and this is what they said. It's a validated plan. It's not made up stuff. I've been in meetings where people say, I think the customer's this, I think the problem's that. And then the VC says, whoa, who have you talked to? Well, nobody. So you go into that, writing that business plan, you've got a validated market. It's really going to speed things along for you and make your life easier. It's going to write itself, and you don't have to write that big plan. You can get into the tool I like is the slide deck, the Sequoia Partners model, which I've used. There's one pager, a lot of talk about the business model and lean canvas, and we're going to talk about those in the webinar coming up. And then there's the traditional written plan, which typically these days is shorter, less spreadsheety, and you may need those for banks and government, but I do want to make a point that the banker I have for a business I work for, it's traditional business, our bankers at BMO, he's a great guy, he wears a suit, your traditional banker, and he would prefer people give him a one-page business plan for any business, whether it's a coffee shop or it's an industrial facility or a real estate project. He just wants to know who the team is, what your assumptions are around revenues. Have you validated your market? He said the big thing is validation of market and team. And I just need that on a sheet of paper. I just need to know that you've thought about it and you've talked to people and you understand your market. I don't want the big, long document. And he'd seen a lot of big business plans written by consultants, and the bank doesn't really read them. So last thing I want to do before questions is link you to some resources. Steve Blank wrote that book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany on the left there, and that's kind of the Bible of the lean startup movement and started the whole customer development process. Steve is a very detailed guy, I guess. I don't know if his background's in engineering or whatever, but he gets into a lot of detail, and somebody wrote a Coles Notes version or the cheat sheet to his book called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development. You can download that for $10 and you can read in about 45 minutes. It's just a PDF. That's a great tool. And Ash Maurya, he developed the Lean Canvas, and he wrote a book about 5 years ago called Running Lean, and he's got a really good practical process for doing customer development interviews. He kind of built on what Steve did. His focus tends to be on IT, but the principles are the same. So it's a good resource. And that's my contact information, and if you have any questions after this, you can reach out to me at that email and that number. But now we're going to open up the floor for questions.
Hi Ryan, thanks. That was really fantastic. We have a few questions from the audience. The first one is about market research reports and the so-called desk research. I understand that the customer interviews are a great way to test your hypotheses, but what role do market research reports have when you're validating your market, and are they still useful?
Yeah, the great question, and the market research reports have a role. They're a good way to get information about understanding your market. If you determine what your market is, the real role they have is when you're trying to determine if the business is scalable. So once you've determined what who your customer is, who your market is, then you can just start sizing that market. In a lot of business plans, we're going to talk about this in the workshop that I'm going to do, or the webinar I'm going to do later, is you got to size your market. How big is this particular market? But you'll find when you start out, you assume that, well, we're going to sell into market X, and it's this big, but you may find that you're going to sell into market C, for example. I tend to think of, and my first degree was in history, so I'm a big research person. I was thinking about this today. Is our professors always taught us there's primary research or secondary research. Primary research is more valuable. So you go out and talk. You do interviews. I remember in history doing seminars. We do for our thesis. We talked to a lot of people. We'd go out and read newspapers and look at artifacts. And then we would do the secondary research in the library. We read journal articles and look at sort of the books that other people had written. That was secondary. So that's why they called it secondary research. And that's why I see the research reports as secondary. You're going to get way more out of talking to the right people in depth than you are from dozens of reports.
Great. My other question is regarding how you communicate the results of your customer interviews when you're talking to VCs. So when they ask, have you validated your market, is it enough to say, I've interviewed 20 industry leaders? Do you need to give names or amount of people you spoke to? What sort of answers are they looking for?
Yeah, I've seen in pitch decks and business plans, and pitch deck is just a short, like a 10 or 12 slide. We talked to X people, or whatever that number is, 36 people, and these are the summary of the findings. An appendix or appendices to a larger, your traditional business plan could list who you talked to and when. It's just like back to the history when we do our thesis, we had to list who we talked to, what day it was, the location, all the details around what we discussed. And like I said, you want to have a box somewhere or a file on Dropbox or wherever, your hard drive, of all that information. You want to collect all that information so you have it. So it depends who you're talking to too. I mean, this is new stuff in a ways, and I'll tell you though that if you can tell an investor that you've actually talked to potential customers, you will set yourself apart from the majority of people who have not actually left the building.
Good to know. We have another question here. So one of our audience members has heard that intellectual property is only as good as the money you have to defend it. What are your thoughts on this quote?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in IP, but I think what the questioner is saying is, if you've got a patent for some technology, and if you have the money to get it protected, that you've got to go defend it. And I've heard a lot of cases where, a big company will just, steal an idea because they can afford to go to court. They can afford the big bills, you maybe can't. That doesn't mean you don't want to look at this. And again, I'm not an expert at IP, but it's worth, before you go out and do those customer development interviews, to make sure you're not doing a public disclosure. My personal, and this is just an aside, and I'm new to bioscience, so I don't understand all the issues around technology. I do, but I'm coming from a background where I kind of said, to heck with IP, because if you can execute better than your competition, you will succeed. And that's really what it comes down to. Ideas are a dime a dozen. There's millions of ideas out there, and maybe not so much in biotech, but in software, for example, look at Facebook. There were 5 or 6 people doing the exact same thing as Zuckerberg, and he just was more aggressive and just better at it, and figured out that he would roll it out by going through university campuses. So, we might not be using Facebook if it wasn't for the way he did it. So I think execution is key. But that said, this is, you know, it all depends on the situation. So I think it's worth at least looking at making sure that you've got your ducks in a row on IP.
Great. We have another question about customer interviews. If you're looking to get expertise from a large organization, do you have any tips on how to get a hold of the decision makers or the person you need to talk to?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is connections, and a lot of what in bioscience, it's a lot of business to business, so it's not consumer, which is nice because it's a smaller group of people and people tend to know each other. So, you know, in meetings I've been in here at BioNB, you're in a room with some entrepreneurs and some people that are what I'd say are, I'm going to call connectors. They're people that have the Rolodex, and they can say, yes, you need to talk to this person, and then when you talk to that person, they can connect you to that other person. If you're cold calling somebody or reaching out of the blue, that's a worthwhile strategy. For example, I said, you know, if you find somebody's name off a conference website, they were a speaker and they work at IBM, you can always do the cold call and reach out. You know, the email works, but you know, the phone does work. You know, in reaching out, doing that cold call, you'd be amazed. You may not get through to them, and you may have to move on to somebody else. But don't stop your customer development process because you're waiting for that one wonderful conversation, because you may never get it. Like I said, I think you need to reach out to 3 times the number of people that you want to interview.
Great. I had another thought on, again, the customer interviews. You talked about some of the fears as to why people don't get out of the building. Do you ever, when you're talking to potential customers, do you ever run the risk of seeming ill-informed or naive? Is there anything that you should really keep to yourself? And how do you seem confident about your market even that early on?
Well, I think it's good to come across as naive and not knowing anything. That's a good way, because even though you might know more than you let on, that way you'll probably get a lot more information from the person. They might explain some basic things that they might have avoided if they thought that you knew more. And remember, what you're trying to do is you're just trying to be open-minded about this, and you're not, at least at the start, is to not, you start with assumption, I think you said about, I think my market's this. Well, you're probably wrong, to be honest with you, so put that aside and listen to what people are saying, and you don't just go on the opinion of one person you talk to. You've got to do a synthesis of who you're talking to. So I would lean towards being naive and open, and just saying, you know, I don't know. I remember I had a boss who was starting out in the field, and he just said, I don't know anything about this. He would tell people this. I don't know anything about this, and I want to learn. And people love, and I would watch people just give him a crash course in everything he needed to know. So I think that being vulnerable does help, at least in that early stage.
So it helps to be humble.
Yeah, yes, and I've made that point about don't be defensive, you know, and this would be hard, you know, the person saying that anybody would do that kind of solution to that problem, we have to be crazy. You've got to listen to what they're saying and not say, whoa, well, no, that you've got that wrong, or whatever it is. So like Steve Blank, I think he says, you're 90% of what you're doing is listening, not talking.
Great. It looks like that's all the questions we have, but I do have a comment actually from someone in the audience. He said, instead of entrepreneurs paying consultants to develop market reports that just regurgitate what they've been told anyways, we need more financial support to hire market developers with more concrete actions instead of them just developing theoretical reports. Do you have any comments on how you and your new role can help entrepreneurs do real market validation?
Well, this is a really good question. I didn't talk about this, but the people that have to do the customer development interviews are the founders. not a consultant, not me. You have to go out and do it. And the reason that, because of that, is because the consultant will just spit back, or I will just spit back what we hear. But you as the founder, you need to hear what people are saying, and you need to be able to understand right from the ground what people are thinking, so that you can make that change. Only you can make that change. And I know this from being an employee in companies. It's harder to convince people at the top about something that they heard, that I heard, than for them to hear it themselves. So, yeah, the hiring the consultant to do your customer validation would be, I wouldn't advise that. It's something you have to do. What was the other part of that question, Jenny? That comment?
I think it was more around the support that's out there, the financial and the services
Yeah,
support.
yeah. Like, well, in the support, now, I can't do your customer validation exercise, but we can help you set that process up. And that's part of what this webinar is to explain what this is. And the big thing that we can do, and we'd love to help on getting you the names of people to start with. And we've done this where we say, here's 10 people you think you should start with. And you've got to go do that. I mean, you're the business owner. It's your idea. You're going to become the, you're the person who's going to benefit from this at the end of the day. So that's your role as the business owner. But we want to support you and get the ball rolling and help you with that network. And we can help you, and oftentimes you start the process and it'll just snowball, and people will go off, and they'll come back and they'll have talked to numerous people and gotten a real wealth of information. So, and then I think there was an element of some discussion of finance there, but this stuff, doing this is cheap. You remember your startup, you got to think about doing everything cheap. I mean, get a little budget for coffee and some paper, and it's really just talking, and send some emails, making some phone calls. So it's not an expensive process. It's more of a time process, but it's time well spent.
It looks like that's all the time we have. Ryan, did you have any closing statements before I wrap everything up?
No, thanks everyone for your time this afternoon, and I hope that was worthwhile and you learned something from it. Thanks so much.